Okay, so chapter 6. The people that lived in hiding. Now began the happiest times that Caspian had ever known. On a fine summer morning, when the dew lay on the grass, he set off with the badger and the two dwarfs up through the forest to a high saddle in the mountains and down onto their sunny southern slopes where one looked across the green wolds of Archenland. "We will go first to the three bulgy bears," said Trumpkin. They came in a glade to an old hollow oak tree covered with moss, and Truffle Hunter tapped with his paw 3 times on the trunk, and there was no answer. Then he tapped again, and a woolly sort of voice from inside said, "Go away, it's not time to get up yet." But then he tapped the 3rd time, and there was a noise like a small earthquake from inside, and a sort of door opened, and out came 3 brown bears, very bulgy indeed, and blinking their little eyes. And when everything had been explained to them, which took a long time because they were so sleepy, they said, just as Truffle Hunter had said they would, that a son of Adam ought to be king of Narnia, and they all kissed Caspian. Now, these were very wet, snuffly kisses, and then they offered him some honey. Caspian didn't really want honey without bread at that time in the morning, but he thought it was polite to accept it, and so he did. And it took him a long time afterwards to get unsticky from the honey. After that, they went on until they came out among some tall beech trees, and Truffle Hunter called out, "Patterwig! Patterwig! Patterwig!" And almost at once, bounding down from branch to branch till he was just above their heads, came the most magnificent red squirrel that Caspian had ever seen. It was far bigger than the ordinary dumb squirrels which he had sometimes seen in the castle gardens. Indeed, it was nearly the size of a terrier. That's kind of a medium-sized dog, small to medium. And the moment you looked in its face, you saw that it could talk. Indeed, the difficulty was to get it to stop talking, for like all squirrels, it was a chatterer. It welcomed Caspian at once and asked if he would like a nut, and Caspian said thanks, he would, but as Patterwig went bounding away to fetch it, Truffle Hunter whispered in Caspian's ear, "Don't look right now, look the other way. It's very bad manners among squirrels to watch anyone going to his store of nuts, or to look as if you wanted to know where it was." Pretty soon Patterwig came bouncing back with the nut, and Caspian ate it, and after that Patterwig asked if he could take any messages to other friends. "For I can go nearly anywhere without setting foot to the ground," he said. Truffle Hunter and the dwarfs thought this was a very good idea, and gave Patterwig messages to all sorts of people with very strange names, telling them all to come to a feast and a council on the dancing lawn at midnight, 3 nights from now. "And you'd better tell the 3 bulgies, too," said Trumpkin. "We forgot to mention it to them." So the Patterwig is going to tell the bears, too. Their next visit was to the 7 brothers of Shuddering Wood. Trumpkin led the way back to the saddle, and then down eastward on the northern slope of the mountains till they came to a very solemn place among rocks and fir trees. They went very quietly, and presently Caspian could feel the ground shaking under his feet as if someone was hammering down below. Trumpkin went to a flat stone about the size of the top of a water tower and stamped on it with his foot. After a long pause, it was moved away by someone or something underneath, and there was a dark round hole with a good deal of heat and steam coming out of it, and in the middle of the hole the head of a dwarf very much like Trumpkin himself. There was a long talk here, and the dwarf seemed much more suspicious than the squirrel or the bulgy bears had been, but in the end the whole party were invited to come down. Caspian found himself descending a dark stairway into the earth, but when he came to the bottom he saw firelight. It was the light of a furnace. The whole place was a smithy. A subterranean stream of water ran past on one side of it. Two dwarfs were at the bellows. One was holding a piece of red, hot metal on the anvil with a pair of tongs. A 4th one was hammering it and hammering it and hammering it, and 2 of them were wiping their horny little hands on a greasy cloth as they were coming forward to meet the visitors. It took some time to satisfy them that Caspian was indeed a friend and not an enemy. But when they finally believed, they all cried. Cried, "Long live the king!" And their gifts were noble, mail shirts and helmets and swords for Caspian and Trumpkin and Nikabrik. The badger could have had the same if he wanted it, but it said it was a beast, and it was, and if its claws and teeth could not keep his skin whole, it wasn't worth keeping. The workmanship of the arms that they had made was far finer than any Caspian had ever seen, and he gladly accepted the dwarf-made sword instead of his own, which looked, in comparison, as feeble as a toy and as clumsy as a stick. The 7 brothers, who were all red dwarfs, promised to come to the feast at Dancing Lawn. A little farther on, in a dry, rocky ravine, they reached the cave of 5 black dwarfs. They looked suspiciously at Caspian, but in the end, the oldest one of them said, "If he's against Miraz, we'll have him for king." And the next oldest said, "Shall we go further up for you, up to the crags? There's an ogre or 2 and a hag that we could introduce you to up there." "Certainly not," said Caspian. "Yes, I should think not indeed," said Truffle Hunter. "We want none of that sort on our side." Nikabrik disagreed with this, but Trumpkin and the badger overruled him. It gave Caspian a shock to realize that the horrible creatures out of the old stories, as well as the nice ones, had some descendants in Narnia as well. "We should not have Aslan for our friend if we brought in that rabble," said Truffle Hunter as they came away from the cave of the black dwarfs. "Oh, Aslan," said Trumpkin cheerily but contemptuously. What matters much more is that you wouldn't have me." "Do you believe in Aslan?" said Caspian to Nikabrik. "Well, I'll believe in anyone or anything," said Nikabrik, "that'll batter these cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything, Aslan or the White Witch, do you understand?" "Silence, silence," said Truffle Hunter. "You don't know what you're saying. She was a worse enemy than Miraz and all his race." "Not to dwarfs, she wasn't," said Nikabrik. So they traveled on. Their next visit was a pleasanter one. As they came lower down, the mountains opened out into a great glen, or a wooded gorge with a swift river running at the bottom. The open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was buzzing with bees. Here Truffle Hunter called again, "Glenstorm! Glenstorm!" And after a pause, Caspian heard the sound of hoofs. It grew louder until the valley trembled, and at last, breaking and trampling the thickets, there came in sight the noblest creatures that Caspian had ever seen. The great centaur Glenstorm and his 3 sons. His flanks were glossy chestnut, and the beard that covered his broad chest was golden red. He was a prophet and a stargazer, and he knew what they had come about. "Long live the king!" he cried. "I and my sons are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?" Well, up until now, neither Caspian nor the others had really been thinking about a war. They had some vague idea, perhaps, of an occasional raid on some human farmstead, or maybe of attacking a party of hunters if it ventured too far into these southern wilds, but for the most part they'd thought only of living to themselves in woods and caves and building up an attempt at old Narnia in hiding. But as soon as Glenstorm had spoken, everyone felt much more serious about the whole thing. "Do you mean a real war to drive Miraz out of Narnia?" asked Caspian. "What else?" said the centaur. "Why else does your majesty go walking around clad in mail and have it wearing a sword?" "Is it possible, Glenstorm?" said the badger. "The time is right," said Glenstorm. "I watch the skies, badger, for it is mine to watch, and as it is yours to remember. Tarva and Alamble have met in the halls of high heaven, and on earth a son of Adam has once more arisen to rule and name the creatures. The hour has struck. Our council at the Dancing Lawn must be a council of war." He spoke in such a voice that, neither Caspian nor the others even hesitated for a moment. It now seemed to them quite possible that they might win a war, and quite certain that they must wage a war. As it was now past the middle of the day, they rested with the centaurs and ate such food as the centaurs provided. cakes of oatmeal and apples and herbs and wine and cheese. The next place they were to visit was quite near at hand, but they had to go a long way around in order to avoid a region in which men lived. And it was well into the afternoon before they found themselves on level fields, warm between hedgerows. There Truffle Hunter called at the mouth of a little hole in a green bank, and out popped the last thing Caspian expected: a talking mouse. Now, he was, of course, bigger than a common mouse. He was well over a foot high when he stood on his hind legs, and with his ears nearly as long, a little broader, but nearly as long as a rabbit's. His name was Reepicheep, and he was a very happy and martial mouse. He wore a tiny little rapier, a small sword, at his side, and twirled his long whiskers as if they were a mustache. "There are 12 of us, sire," he said with a dashing and graceful bow, "and I place all the resources of my people unreservedly at your majesty's disposal." Caspian tried hard and successfully not to laugh, but he couldn't help thinking that Reepicheep and all his people could very easily be put in a washing basket and carried home on one's back. Now, it would take too long to mention all the creatures whom Caspian met that day. Clodsley, Shovel the Mole, the 3 hard-biters who were badgers like Truffle Hunter, Camillo the hare, and Hogglestock the hedgehog. They rested at last beside a well at the edge of a wide and level circle of grass, bordered with tall elm trees, which now threw long shadows across the grass. For the sun was setting, the daisies were closing, and the rooks flying home to bed. Here they ate food they'd brought with them, and Trumpkin lit his pipe. Knickerbrick was not a smoker. "Now," said the badger, "if only we could wake the spirits of these trees and this well, we should have done a good day's work." "Well, can't we?" said Caspian. "No," said Truffle Hunter. "We've no power over them. Since the humans came into the land, felling forests and defiling streams, the dryads and naiads have sunk into a deep sleep. Who knows if they'll ever stir again? And that is a great loss to our side. The Telmarines are horribly afraid of the woods, and once the trees moved in anger, our enemies would go mad with fright, and, well, they'd be chased out of Narnia just as quick as their legs could carry them." "What imagination you animals have," said Trumpkin. Who didn't believe in such things? But why stop at trees and waters? Wouldn't it be even nicer if the stones started throwing themselves at old Miraz? The badger only grunted at this, and after that there was such a silence that Caspian had nearly dropped off to sleep when he thought he heard a faint musical sound from the depth of the woods at his back. And then he thought, no, it's only a dream, and he turned over again and closed his eyes. But as soon as his ear touched the ground, he felt or heard, it was hard to tell if he felt it or heard it, but there was a faint beating or drumming. He raised his head. The beating noise at once became fainter, but the music returned, clearer this time. It was like flutes. Do you know what flutes sound like? He saw that Truffle Hunter was sitting up, staring into the woods. The moon was bright. Now, Caspian had been asleep longer than he thought. Nearer and nearer came the music, a tune that was wild and yet dreamy, and the noise of many light feet, till at last out from the woods into the moonlight came dancing shapes such as Caspian had been thinking of all his life. They weren't much taller than dwarfs, but far slighter and more graceful. Their curly heads had little horns. The upper part of their bodies gleamed naked in the pale light, but their legs and feet were those of goats. "Fawns!" cried Caspian, jumping up, and in a moment they were all around him. It took next to no time to explain the whole situation to them, and they accepted Caspian at once. Before he knew what he was doing, he found himself joining in the dance with the fawns. Trumpkin, with heavier and jerkier movements, did likewise, and even Truffle Hunter hopped and lumbered about as best he could. Only Knickerbrick stayed where he was, looking on in silence. The fawns footed it all around Caspian to their reedy pipes. Their strange faces, which seemed mournful and merry all at once, looked into his, dozens of faws, Mentius, and Abentinus, and Dumnus, Volans, Voltinus, Gerbius, Nymenius, Nossus, and Oskins, Pattertwig. Pattertwig had sent them all. Pattertwig, remember him? He was the squirrel, the large squirrel. He had told the fawns all about him and sent them here. When Caspian awoke next morning, he could hardly believe that it hadn't all been a dream. But the grass was covered with little cloven hoof marks from where they had been dancing. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7, Old Narnia in Danger. So you better come back to hear chapter 7.